This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Spring Creek Model Trains. Family owned for nearly 25 years, Spring Creek is your destination for model trains. Check out springcreekmodeltrains.com for a wide variety of offerings from today's top manufacturers and exclusive products found nowhere else. Whether in Deschler, Nebraska, or at a train show near you, stop in and say wow. To see where they'll be next, visit their website at springcreekmodeltrains.com. From trackside to roadside and wherever you'd see a sign, Scale Signs has it all. With over 1,400 offerings in N, HO, S, and O scale, Scale Signs has the largest collection of fine scale signs on the planet. Come see the details that bring your models to life on their website, scalesigns.com. If you're looking to bring more realism to your layout industries, look no further than tullymodels.com, the home of Southern Tier Grain Modeler Supply and Steel Mill Modeler Supply. With models to fit steam, transition, and diesel eras, Kevin Tully has you covered with all of the components you'll need to take your grain and steel mills to the next level. Check out the entire catalog at tullymodels.com. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott, so glad you could join us. We're going to be talking about the MKT Sedalia Subdivision, and joining me to do that, the owner, Mike Landis. Mike, welcome to the show.
Glad to see you again. Glad to be back.
Good to see you again. I was looking, September 26, 2023 was the last time you've been on the show, so it's been way too long.
Yeah.
But it hasn't been that long since I've seen you. I got to see you at the St. Louis RPM last year.
We did. That was an awesome show. I've been going for several years, and it's always a blast. Getting bigger and bigger every year, both with the number of people coming, the number of vendors. So it's always exciting to go the next year to see who you're going to see and what you're going to see.
Yeah, that's for sure. It was my first experience last year, and I've been talking about it a bit, and I talked for it probably months after, to a point, maybe nauseum for some people, but it really was just an amazing experience. When people ask me, I say, the no kidding model railroaders were all there, and the camaraderie was unbelievable. And of course, the exhibits, the models on display, the clinics, just everything about it was so well done. Lonnie and his team are just knocking it out of the park, and I'm looking forward to it again this year, and I believe you're going to be there as well, right?
I will be there. I have that on my calendar and a budget set aside to buy plenty, but as always. But yeah, looking forward to seeing everybody. It's always great to, a lot of folks like you. I see y'all online constantly, but it's always nice to catch up in person, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that was what it was too. There was a lot of opportunities to put faces to names and voices, and that also was a thrill. Great location right in the middle of the country, and the weather was that's going to be tough to beat this year, because last year it was so nice, and I'd heard horror stories about the year before and how hot it was.
Yeah,
we'll hope for the best, but it was just an all-around fantastic time, and I'm looking forward to getting back out to St. Louis again this year and seeing folks like you. So
yeah, same here.
Something to look forward to. But for now, we've had some big news since September 26, 2023. You have been making some big changes in your, not only your life, but your railroad as well. And we're going to go through that. And you've been covering that, of course, on your YouTube channel, The Main Track. And we're going to go back over it again here and learn a bit more about the MKT Sedalia Sub.
Mm-hmm.
But first, why don't you give us a little bit of a review of the first edition of the MKT Sedalia Sub for those that may have missed that episode back in 2023?
Yeah, so the MKT Sedalia subdivision was part of the Katy Railroad's main line to St. Louis. It was a secondary line, and that is what I spent part of my childhood growing up watching when I lived in Sedalia, Missouri. And so that kind of stuck with me as one of my favorite railroads and routes in particular for all those years. And so a handful of years ago, I finally began building the layout. And when I built it, I knew it was going to be sort of a temporary layout. I kind of filled my garage with it. Didn't have a basement in my previous house. And so I built out as much as I could with the full intention of eventually moving that. So it was more of a point to point. I didn't have the world's largest amount of space, but I made the best that I could with the space that I had there in the garage. Got a lot done. It was a lot of fun, but it was unfortunate that there was no heat or air conditioning either way. And so when the weather got really bad or extreme, which it does here in Missouri, a lot of times, a lot of days and weeks that would go by without being able to work on the layout. But I was able to rebuild or model the city of Sedalia and kind of a few miles on either side of that, knowing that would be some point part of a bigger layout once I got to that point.
Yeah, and as you were building it, I think I remember you saying that you were doing that all with the mindset of being able to reuse what you were building on the first
Mhm.
layout.
Yeah. It was also a modular setup. I was not using, Modutrack, or Fremo standards per se. It was sort of my own little standard, but building modules as I went along and one section at a time. And so I would get one part of it where I'd like, and then kind of add on a new section. And so the end goal being this could be a section that I could bring with me and add on to, and just be one little part of the ultimate dream layout whenever I got there.
I'm thinking about what you were saying about building it out in the garage, and the extreme weather of either heat or cold kept you away from it, and
Yeah.
that must have been really tough, because I think about when weather becomes extremely hot or cold, that's usually when I either slip inside or slip down to the basement and work on the layout. So that must have been a little bit of a struggle for you, because all that layout time kind of taken
Yeah.
away.
Yeah. And I may do, the layout was in the garage, but I had a spare bedroom inside that I was able to put, a small amount of bench work on a wall. And that allowed me to, just scratch that itch to run some trains back and forth. And I also had a workshop where I could do, painting or decaling of both rolling stock or, structures. And that's kind of the time when I would do a lot of work on structures. So when I got those constructed, weather got nicer, I could go outside and put them on the layout. So I found ways to get around that.
To what point did you get that layout complete?
I would say, there were portions of it that I would say was, 98% complete. I had a kind of around the walls and I had a peninsula in the middle. So, parts of the layout were pretty close to being finished. There were other parts that were about 50%. There were a couple of sections that was just simply roadbed on bare foam, and I hadn't gotten very far with that. There got to be a point where when I realized, I'm needing a new house, I can start shopping, just things fell into place to get a new house, that I slowed down the construction, knowing that I was going to be packing this up. Didn't want to get too far and be too big of a mess to tear down, which I'm sure we'll get into shortly. But just depends upon the section. But definitely, I was able to run trains and have areas that I was able to film for my episodes on the main track.
Did you operate your layout, or was it more for the videography, photography aspect of it? Which angle did you take there?
A little bit of both. I really like researching structures and, building those. And that takes up a lot of my time. I just like going down rabbit holes, learning about grain elevators or power plants, things nobody else on the planet really cares about. But I'm out there, trying to figure out, things down to the inch. I love doing that. But I did have some operations. The part of the layout that I had done originally was the city of Sedalia, and that's not a major place like Kansas City or anything like that. There were a handful of industries, and I had been able to model those. And so it was enough to keep me busy, just to have fun with operations. I didn't ever have a bunch of people over to do any operations because there just wouldn't have been enough for people to do if they did that. But just enough to keep me busy, on a night that I wanted a break from, building stuff, just to have some fun running the trains.
Sounds like you're a really tight prototype modeler. How tight is that? What kind of license do you give yourself, if any at all?
Well, I would say I gave myself more of a license with my first incarnation of the layout than I am now. I am using the original MKT track plans that came from the MKT headquarters back in 1983. And so I have a bunch of people ask me, what's your layout plan? Do you have that drawn out? And I do have some basic sketches of it. I've not come out with a nice graphic. That's partly because a lot of those programs for layout planning are based on Windows. I'm a Mac guy. And so I've not really found out a program that's worked really well for me yet. But long story short, I'm using the MKT track plan. And when I get to a section, I just simply recreate it. Things are obviously condensed, whereas there may be a section of railroad that's a mile long. I've got 10 feet to work with. So things are squished quite a bit. But when it comes to the turnouts, where the industries are, minus that condensing right there, I'm doing my best to stay as close to the prototype as possible.
Which seems to maybe have its own challenges, yet one thing it seems to take away is the requirement to have to create this, because you're basically going to what the railroad did. They already figured this stuff out for you. Now you're just taking their plan and running with it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of guys when they're designing their layout, if it's, a proto freelance, for instance, or completely freelance, they like putting in these intricate switching puzzles and that's a lot of fun as well, but they will go through great lengths to, where they put the turnouts in the industries and making it challenging on purpose. When you're using the railroads track plans, as I just mentioned, they came up with it. They knew what worked best on the prototype. And so that does make it a little easier on me that I'm not having to come up with anything intricate. Some people may find that boring, but I'm just going by what the real guys did for me 40 some odd years ago.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, they've done the work. Why not just run with their plan? And yeah, that makes it easier for you. But then I guess the flip side of that is trying to stay true to that prototype and the challenges of compression. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I like detailed stuff. And if you look at my layout, if it comes to my locomotives and my rolling stock, I wouldn't call myself a rivet counter, at least if it comes down to, the rolling stock and such. But when it comes to the layout itself with the track plan, I know how it should be, and I know what it should look like, and I want to recreate things that I remember from my childhood. I have the track plans to go on. I have the photos to go on. But as I was mentioning, you've got to condense things sometimes. There's only so much that you can fit in, even though I've got a lot more space here in my current spot. But you've got to figure out what can you live without, and you've got to make some cuts here and there. That's kind of something that bugs me sometimes because I'm imagining people coming to the layout and thinking, hey, why did you skip this industry or skip this town? And I wish I could model it all. I wish I had an unlimited amount of space. Maybe one day, who knows? But that is part of the harder aspects, I think, of when you're trying to do a prototype, is trying to figure out what can you slice out and still get the point across of what you're trying to recreate.
So on a scale of, say, completely freelance to Isaac Fabris, you're
Mhm.
probably somewhere maybe towards Isaac, but not quite that level.
I would say so. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of Katy guys who really like to focus on, rolling stock or locomotives and whatnot. And thankfully, a lot of manufacturers have come out with some really great Katy stuff recently, stuff that they never had all these years. I'm not sure why there's suddenly an explosion of Katy stuff, but I'm loving it and going along with it. That's made it easier for me. But years ago, when there wasn't a lot of Katy stuff, there was a lot more scratch building and kit bashing involved. And I made do with stuff. It wasn't exact, but I'm thankful that folks like, Scale Trains and Atherogenesis are doing a lot of that hard work for us nowadays.
Absolutely. Is there something when it comes to locomotives and rolling stock that's missing that you can't wait for them to make? Is there like one thing that's kind of on your list that, boy, I need to have that?
Man, my favorite Katy locomotive was the GP39-2. Atherogenesis came out with it. They've done a couple of runs, and actually this week announced a third run. So I'll have plenty of those. They had 20 of them on their roster. What I'm excited about is the Atherogenesis F units in the Katy scheme, in the green and the yellow. My modeling era, 1987, is after most of the F units were gone. They had a former F unit that was converted to a booster, and so it had that car body still. But I'm looking forward to getting those F units and maybe having some backdated operating sessions. That's one thing that I'm able to do, I guess. It's my layout. And my rolling stock that I have is all mostly early 80s for the most part. And so everything will fit with that. But those, man, I think those F units that Katy had in that scheme was real classy. And so I'm looking forward to having some of those. And I will take one of those and convert it into one of those booster units so I can still use it when I'm running 1987 like normal.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've got some guardrails, but they're fairly loose, and then you
Yeah.
can kind of make it flex and make it so that you can enjoy it and cover a bunch of MKT history.
Yeah, exactly. And I've learned not to beat myself up too much. I like things to be as close to prototypical as possible. But for instance, I was mentioning I like getting out and measuring structures or maybe a grain mill. And I'm doing the measurements and wanting to think, man, I got to get it just this certain way. But there is nobody on planet Earth that knows the dimensions of that grain elevator from 40 years ago. You can create it and people can recognize it, but not to get so detailed with it that you stress yourself out or give yourself anxiety, because the only person that knows that grain elevator, the roof up there is 10 feet by 50 feet would be me. I hold the key to that knowledge, and nobody else probably even cares for that matter.
Yeah, well, that's kind of funny. The things that we care about is it's really about us,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
when you're building a layout, those kind of details. But the other part of it too is the difference between authentic and replica.
Hmm.
And sometimes it's just going to be a fair representation, right,
Yeah,
of what that
exactly.
is going to be.
And that's what I'm going for. I've seen so many layouts that I know they're based on a prototype. Maybe, for instance, Cajon Pass or the railroads around Kansas City. I go to those layouts and I recognize the scenes, and I would know no difference if they have a structure there that's, maybe not exact with the measurements, friends, but they do the good job of, you know, displaying the general idea. And that's what it's really all about, just getting that point across.
Yeah, that again, fair representation of an area so that you're convinced, right,
Yeah,
that that's where that
exactly.
that area is. So talk about the first layout before we move on from it. Talk about some of the solid lessons you learned while creating that first layout.
I'm trying to think here. I think maybe my track work. I like to have really great looking track. I learned a lot of lessons with my last layout. And when you're building things, you get something down, and sometimes you can redo it. But as time goes on, you have things that come up that you think, if I could redo this again, I would do it again. And thankfully, I got the chance to do that. But there are just general things, I suppose, maybe with my wiring, some of my track work, for instance, stuff that, that's the main part of your layout is the trackage. And so when you sit there and you look at it for long enough, it may look fantastic at first, but when you're spending there, hours of time to look at your track, things kind of pop up. And so I've really worked hard on this new layout to make the track even more prototypical with just some of the techniques I've learned, for instance, with weathering the track and some of the more intricate details with track weight, for instance. And that's one thing that I've really learned, and I'm kind of trying to focus on with this one. I haven't gotten to a major scenery phase yet, but I've been able to spend a lot of time learning some new techniques that I'm looking forward to implementing on this one as well.
I think the overall idea of your first layout really hits home one of the points that we've really hit here on the podcast. And we just discussed it with Lance Minheim, knowing that your layout now doesn't have to be your forever layout. And
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
kind of knew that all along. So it really gave you that platform to learn,
Mhm.
knowing that there was going to be another opportunity to do this.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was one of the things during the construction is, you would learn things that if I could do this over again, I would do it. On the layout I'm at right now, if there's something that I do and I'm not happy with it, this may not be my forever layout, but it is going to be a very long time layout. And so if I need to redo something, I will redo it now, just knowing I'm going to be here for a while. Whereas before, it's good enough. I can live with it for the next year or so until I start building my new layout. So it gave me some grace there, perhaps.
Yeah, it's like it is a balance of not sitting in the same spot, spinning your wheels, moving forward, but then
Exactly.
also that note again makes me think of Don Iris and the thing he said about his notebook called "Things I'll Never Do Again." And it sounds like
Right.
you kind of had that. Maybe it was more things I want to do a little better, but nonetheless. And I think Don should publish that book. Maybe half of it be some guidance, and then maybe the back half just be blank pages so that you can start writing scribbling notes about
Yeah, yeah.
about
I would
that.
love.
But yeah, I think it's a great concept, and being able to not wait, get your feet wet, get into something, and then even with your mentality of this stuff can be reused and being able to move it over.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of gets into our, move and rebuild. Yeah, I built that first layout with a full intention of moving it. And even when I was building it, there were several books out there talking about, building these modular type layouts that, whether you move them to different train shows or in a train club or in your house, you can pack them up and get them back together. So I built things with that in mind, but quickly learned when I got it to the new place, tried to put these parts back together, it just wasn't the same. things were just not lining up the same. I don't know what it is. Maybe perhaps the different environments, having built the other one in the garage. I have climate control now. I'm not sure what the difference is, but I could never get it to be as perfect as it was with the alignment of everything. And so that's kind of what led me to realize that maybe I could have done something differently, but it's given me a chance to do something brand new.
As you're starting to learn that you're not going to be able to quite reuse this the way you wanted to,
Mhm.
was there any fear of, oh boy, am I going to be able to recreate this? Because I know I've seen these photos of your first layout. You did some
Mhm.
beautiful scenery.
Appreciate that.
Did you get to that point where, like, that little bit of doubt and uncertainty about being able to recreate it?
A little bit. In a lot of these scenes you spend so many hours on, and for instance, if you're recreating a section of track through a town, at that very moment, you're sitting there researching it. You're so deep in it mentally, and it's fresh on your mind when you're sitting there constructing it. And so it did cross my mind that, in the future, or for instance, right now, that stuff's not fresh on my mind. It's not, in my mind's eye, if you want to use that term, of what it looks like. And so am I going to have to go back and research all that stuff again and dive right in? And it's a possibility. There are things that I may have missed before that'll give me a chance to perhaps go around and correct that. But, a lot of the techniques, track laying or scenery, those basic things are going to be the same no matter where you're building or what layouts you're building. But getting it all to look exactly like you want, that's the big challenge there.
Let's talk about the planning process. I mean, you talked about bringing parts of the old layout with you, so you had some of an idea. But as you purchased this new home, tell me a little bit about that process of getting this planned for.
This has been quite a task in itself. So I bought this house, quite a bit larger than my old one. Partly the basement was the reason I purchased this house. That's a model railroader thing, obviously. But the downstairs, I need it to be fully open, like people do with layouts. But it was full of bedrooms and bathrooms and a nice kitchen and almost a whole second house down here. So I realized I've got to tear all this stuff out. And so that took several months before I could even put up any of my layout, did all the process of tearing out the walls and putting in new, ceilings and lighting and all of that stuff. And so that was I would say the biggest challenge that kind of kept me busy for several months. And me being, I would call it impatient. You buy this house for your big layout, and then you realize this is going to be a major project. And whether it's model railroading or a home remodeling project, you know how it goes. You start something and it's never as easy as you think it's going to be. There's always something that comes up, unfortunate surprises that, take a little longer than you expect or whatnot. But for planning purposes, once I got that out, then I had an open room and I could start laying things out. And when I realized what the space I was going to have to work with, it's different dimensions than even half my garage was. And so I realized that, the original layout was going to have to just be scrapped, for instance. And, moving forward, realizing what I had to work with was going to be a completely different space. So it was exciting, but also a pretty big challenge, realizing that I was literally starting from scratch for the most part.
In between ripping walls out and ripping old kitchens and modifying this basement, I can imagine it must have been tough because you had this layout in the first home where you could basically go down and run trains whenever you wanted of sort.
Yeah.
And now that's gone away. Talk about the in between times. I mean, how were you filling that?
Well, the construction kept me pretty busy, but I was still able to do work. As in my last house, when my layout was in the garage, I had a workshop inside that I was able to work on structures or rolling stock or whatnot. I did a lot of that, and so I had an extra building or not a building, but an office that I was able to make into my workshop, and so I did a lot of that. Just continued building structures, researching things, driving the hour north to the remnants of my prototype, taking measurements, just collecting stuff that I knew that I would need for this new layout. And when I started building the new layout, realizing I may not have the opportunity to make all these trips up there. Thankfully, it's only an hour away, but it's still an hour away. You can't exactly, just run up there anytime you want. And so I made sure I had all this amount of research on hand ahead of time, sort of in my files here that I'll be able to access and have been able to get into as I've started rebuilding things here.
And I guess that research is a great way to keep that flywheel turning is and keep your hopes up of this new layout to come and be able to keep that momentum going.
Mhm.
During this research process, was there something that you learned that you didn't know before, or maybe that you learned that you thought before and now it's completely different? What was that process like for you?
One of the things that I've learned a lot more about that I didn't really pay attention to years ago, oddly enough, was the signaling. I love crossing signals. The route that I'm modeling was dark territory, so there were no signals whatsoever. And so the only type of signaling that I can have on the layout is with crossing signals. And that's been a strange little side obsession that I've had with my line. The Katy Railroad's been gone since 1988. Part of the line that I'm modeling is still in operation, is a short line, Missouri and northern Arkansas. But they've come in over the last 40 years and made a lot of alterations, ripped out all the crossing signals. And these were signals that I saw when I was a kid, but didn't really pay much attention to. You didn't have a cell phone back in 1988 to capture all these images. And just like you go trackside right now, you look at a crossing signal, you don't think twice about it. It'll always be there, but I realized that this was information that I should have, captured. So I've had to do a lot of research going back and finding out about these signals. And I've got a friend who is helping build some of those for me. They had a very strange collection of crossing signals along this line, ones I've never seen on any other route anywhere. I'm not sure if it was the Katy Railroad's test bed for signals for the rest of the system, but that's been kind of fun. And, one thing that I've been able to learn a lot about, because now I have all the room for these different communities with crossings and the signals. So I've got a lot of them to build going forward.
Talk about researching just that. Where did you find information on crossing signals for the MKT?
There's a lot of documentation, through the Katy Railroad Historical Society that you have access to. And over the years, they published, in the Katy Flyer, just different articles over the years that you have access to. I have released a DVD. It's called Katie's Country. And there's a gentleman up in Clinton, Missouri, along the line that I'm modeling. And he got a camcorder back in the 1980s and loved the railroad. And so he literally documented the final years of the Katy Railroad. And he lent me 8 hours of footage of the Katy Railroad in its final years. I've compiled some of that into that DVD, but I've got all that footage and I've had to go through all of it and find these crossing signals. Once again, he was filming the trains and not the crossing signals. Those were just background items. But I've been able to go through a lot of that footage and find the signals, and with that, kind of compile some rough drawings that I need. Once again, they're not going to be exact, but they've been gone for 20 or 30 years. No one's going to know the difference. They may be able to look at it and think, oh, I remember those strange signals. But once again, it's one of those things that's good enough for me, and it will likely be for everybody else when I get those constructed.
No, I can imagine the gold when you got those tapes in hand, and then of course you're watching them, and I can imagine you pan to the left, pan to the left. Let's see those signals. The
Yeah,
focus is the train, but you're looking for signals, and it's
yeah,
funny how we all are, have our niche thing that we enjoy about railroading beyond the trains, and for you, the crossing signals really became a thing.
yeah. Kind of a strange thing, but I know a lot of guys like, building block signals and semaphores and whatnot. Just sort of another version of that, maybe a little unusual, but that's the only opportunity I have for any kind of animated lighting, really, when it comes to my layout now.
Don't say too strange because I love
Yeah.
crossing signals and I've got to
Okay.
have them on my layout too. I mean,
Yeah.
just the fact that, especially, automated stuff, I think that's
Mhm.
really fun for us to see and for visitors to see. It's like, again, a fantastic simulation of the real world when
Yeah.
you see the crossing gates. We've all sat there and waited for a train, and
Yeah.
we all get excited when we start to see the alternating flashing lights that something's coming. I mean, even to this
Exactly. Yeah.
day, I get excited, and so yeah,
It's a part
that's
of the experience. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a part of the
absolutely.
whole vibe of rail fanning.
Yeah, and it's something that it's fun to find those, like, again, niche things that you just dive right down the rabbit hole and just go absolutely bonkers with. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's fun that this hobby allows amazing things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's talk about the new plan. And as far as I know, you're adding a bit more with some additional space. Talk about that and your why behind adding some more to the Sedalia Sub.
Yeah, I've got a lot more space, and that's going to allow me to model a lot more towns. in my garage, in my last layout, I was modeling the approximately 20-mile stretch from Sedalia back to the community of Green Ridge back to the south. So it was a very short, stretch right there, included the industries in Sedalia and then a grain elevator and a couple of other smaller industries in Green Ridge. Well, now with the new layout, I am able to model the section from Sedalia through Green Ridge all the way back to Clinton, almost 40 miles to the south, and then on to the town of Appleton City. So I've got about 60 miles worth of layout that I'm able to build right now. And that is with taking a lot of the communities out. I had to decide, which towns were, the most interesting, that had the most, active industries and stuff to provide that. A lot of cool towns. I've visited those towns so many times, just taking pictures and researching. So I love them all, but I had to make some choices there. So I will have my basement here is about 50 feet wide by 30 feet. And so once again, it's not the world's largest space, but it's going to be enough to keep me busy for quite a while. And it's going to allow me to, model Sedalia, Clinton, another major town, a lot of those cool little towns in between. So that's my plan right now. The portion that I had built originally from Sedalia back to that small town of Green Ridge, that's scrapped. So that will be, rebuilt. But I have all the structures. And that's one of the great things is, although the bench work, a lot of the track I had to scrap, all of the things that make those scenes what they are, crossing signals, buildings, I have all of those. And so I'm going to be able to easily replicate those portions of the layout.
You said the last time you went for the modular approach. Tell us about your choice for bench work this time around.
It's quite a bit different. In my mind before, in other layouts I had constructed, I always in my mind thought the bench work needed to be about 2 feet wide. And I think that's pretty standard on a lot of layouts. That gives you enough space for your trackage, plenty of buildings and whatnot. And so I had always built my layouts to be that dimension on my bench work. And so I always enjoyed that. It always gave me plenty of, opportunities for building industries or yards or whatnot. When I got this house and began planning for the layout, I kind of ran through several different scenarios. And there's been a lot of layouts built in the recent years that I've been noticing that have a lot narrower bench work. And I've seen some layouts where the layout, width is maybe a foot or shorter. And, with photo backdrops, that wasn't anything that we really had at our disposal years ago. You can take those photo backdrops and put those on, a foot wide bench work, and it looks like it goes on for miles. One of the good things about modeling the plains and the prairies of West Central Missouri is whether my layout is 3 feet wide or 1 foot, it's going to look the same. I don't have to worry about mountains and hills and recreating that. So it works really well for my format, my location that I'm using right here. So far, there's a couple of areas of the layout that I built out that will be about 2 feet wide, including I'm building the Kansas City Power and Light power plant. That'll be 2 feet wide because I've got to have a yard there for unloading the coal trains. But the rest of it that I have going around so far is about 1 foot wide. And, that gives you plenty of space for a track and some scenery. And once I get those photo backdrops back there, it's going to take your eye, far into the distance. And so I'm pretty excited about that. There'll be some other areas of the layout, probably Clinton when I get to there and Sedalia, that'll need to be at 2 feet wide. But when you're running, I've got this space now for long runs. You don't need 2 feet wide. And so having just that 1 foot width is working really well so far, getting what I need in there. And I'm, looking forward to getting those backdrops to making it look even better.
I'm a big proponent of narrow bench work whenever possible. And one thing that we hear from many guests and see in person is just how achievable narrow bench work is as well. It's half of what you need to do scenery on.
Exactly. When I was doing my measurements, I realized that building the bench work to that size was going to allow me to get twice as much layout in here. Because when you think about it, you're doing 1 foot as opposed to 2 feet, like you just mentioned. It's twice as much. One thing that's also nice is, some of us have unlimited money, most of us don't. But when you think about it, when you're building layout, that's all that scenery material, and so you're able to achieve a great look with less scenery, because more scenery means you've got to spend more time, you've got to spend more money. And so I would recommend this as a way for people that maybe are on a budget to be able to build a layout, because you've got less to have to do to recreate what you're trying to.
Yeah, if you got a tight budget, either with money or time,
Yeah,
definitely that narrow approach, and or if you're on a budget when it comes to space, like you said, and
true.
we've talked on the podcast that aisle space is so important, and if you can trade off, I would rather have a little bit wider aisle and a little less railroad than the other way around, and then you're squeezing in and you're quite uncomfortable trying to work on and operate it.
And being able to fit enough in here, I'm trying to keep 3 feet to 3.5 feet on the wiles. That's not the widest aisles out there. I've seen some layouts where people have really squeezed them in, and you got to work with what space you have. I totally understand that, but I wanted to be able to, have enough space where people could pass each other, that I could get through comfortably. And so that's kind of the compromise they came up to was, 3.5 foot on the width right there. Would go wider if I could, but even though this space is a lot bigger than what I had before, it's still not the world's biggest space. And you still have to make compromises when it comes to what you're going to be able to include in there, and then narrowing things down to, comfort levels down here in the room versus the amount of space you have for modeling.
Now you talked about removing a whole bunch of rooms and walls and
Yeah.
whatnot. Were there any other challenges that you faced in this basement to try to get the track plan to work for you in it?
There is, and I've had some people ask me about this, why I'm building my layouts in the order that I am. Kind of a fun surprise here when this room down here was full of walls and individual, rooms and such. You can't really see what's below the carpet and the flooring. So when we got the walls out of here, realized that in half the basement there was just a slope, may have been put there naturally with the construction of the foundation, but the floor was completely uneven, which you couldn't tell when you're just walking around on carpeting, but it's the bare floor. And so getting the flooring redone has been a massive, massive project. And so whereas I would have normally, worked on the outsides and my central peninsula, which I'm going to have right here, I've had to focus on building around the walls. And so I've had a lot of guys on the channel asking me, why aren't you building down the middle? The flooring is an ongoing project, even this long, and still don't have the floor fully repaired. But getting the outer walls done, getting that part focused on and completed is going to take me a while and giving me plenty of time to get the flooring done. But that was a pretty big challenge trying to figure out what to do with that, because you want your layout to be the level, when you get that constructed. Other than that, I wanted to include the bathroom down here. That sounds like a really simple thing, but I've been to a lot of guys' layouts where they had, large basements and they wanted the real estate, every last bit of it. So they took their bathrooms out, which is fine and dandy, but that means you've got to go upstairs to use the restroom. If I'm down here working on a project or something and just need to run and use it, yeah, I could walk upstairs, but I wanted to have that down here. I thought that was kind of important as well for whenever people are over here visiting. I can just have everybody come through some of my back entryway doors right there and really spend the whole time down here, having everything, the facilities that you need with a refrigerator, with the bathroom, a small lounge area, just so you can, spend time down here. Like,
Yeah, that's definitely a plus when you're able to do that, when you're able to have people over. And sometimes it's an awkward situation to
yeah,
walk through people's personal living space to get to
mm,
their layouts. So yeah, it is nice when you're able to provide a separate entrance and a restroom that's dedicated to the layout, and you're not going upstairs. And I mean, some folks, obviously we can't avoid it. It's the way it is, or you got to come through the living room to go to the basement. But when you can avoid that, that's certainly a plus.
yeah, exactly. And so with the restroom, obviously I have to have a furnace and a water heater. So I had to leave that part of the room right next to it. So there were things that I had to leave carved out of necessity. I mean, I could have done something with the furnace or the water heater or moved that, but that would have been kind of expensive in the long run. But had to carve a little bit out. But had I had that for the extra real space of the layout, it wouldn't have made a huge difference. I mean, it's a pretty small area that I had to reserve there.
Yeah, creature comforts are very important as
They
well.
are.
So yeah, great that you were able to include that. So you mentioned that you're working on the floor, you're working on getting layout up and around the walls and
Yeah.
getting this done. You're definitely doing it the right way. Get that room finished the right way first, build yourself a
Yeah.
good foundation and a comfortable space to hold your layout. I see, through what we talk about your YouTube channel, the main track, and not only are you covering this process on that, and we'll provide the links here on our website, aroundthelayout.com/158. You've also been doing some layout visits. Tell us about
Yeah.
when you go to see these layouts, the lessons learned for your own layout. What are you bringing home with you?
I'm getting a lots of great ideas. And yeah, I've got, plenty of stuff to keep me busy and make videos here on my own layout. But I love going on layout tours and just seeing how people do things. And, I learn a lot that way. That there's things that you may not think about. You can sit there and watch YouTube videos or, read great magazine articles. Actually seeing these other layouts in person, you walk away with a lot of stuff. You're able to interact with the layout owner and ask questions about, how they did things and how they accomplished things. I'm trying to think of, particular layouts. One that I was at just a couple of weeks ago was the Colorado Model Railroad Museum in Greeley, Colorado. They've got so much space. They're modeling the mountains more than I would ever be able to do. But there was just a lot of great stuff that they've done. If you've been out there, it's definitely well worth the visit if you have not. But, just walking away with seeing how they've done stuff and how they made really good use of their bench work and their space and putting a lot into the amount of space that they have right there. One thing I've gone back and forth on a lot of guys that I've seen is two-level layouts. When I was doing my planning, I would do some visits of layouts and I would see how you could fit twice as much into a room with a double decker. I am kind of a strange height. I am almost 6'6". I'm a tall guy. And so building the layout to my eye level would be above the heads of most people. And so I had to take into account, my comfort getting my eye level. Then if I were to build a lower level, I'd be needing to be in a chair, on a roller chair down or something down below there. But going back to the question of these other layouts, that was one type of layout that I really liked seeing that I thought I was going to be able to incorporate, but I have decided against that. But I just like doing these layout tour videos. My day job is I'm a news broadcaster. And so what I do is I travel around, I meet people, I see new things, and I tell the world what I learned that day. And so that's what I like about the layout tours is kind of applying that, getting to have fun, seeing how people do things, and just kind of letting everybody know, hey, this is what I liked, this is what I saw, and hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, we're always encouraging here on the podcast to go out and see as many layouts as possible. And there's seemingly a takeaway from every single layout you see. And sometimes they're good. And sometimes, like you said, you see things and then you look at them and say, it's nice, but I don't think I could apply it or it's not for me.
Exactly. Yeah. Everyone's got their own situation and circumstance. And, I remember years ago before I was even able to start building a layout, you see these amazing layouts online or in books or in magazines. And part of you thinks, man, how could I ever do that? How could I ever accomplish that? Knowing you may not have the time or the resources, it can be kind of overwhelming. So it's really easy to compare your layout and your modeling to somebody else in a bad way, but it's also in a good way because you're able to get all of these ideas that you can, apply to your own and, just get inspiration, aside from the techniques, just like being in that railroad museum in Greeley, just looking around and taking in what I call artwork, just enough to get you inspired. And as soon as I got home back here to Missouri, I was down here in the layout, trying to just get out that motivation that I had built up from just watching so much of the great stuff that they have created there.
That's a great point. Another thing that you can do with visiting other layouts, it can be it could be a recharge. It
Yeah.
can certainly kick your flywheel moving and get you going again for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love doing that. So every layout I go to, no matter how large, how small, I always walk away with something that I've learned. And so it's always fun, incorporating that into my layout. And so I think that's really how all of our layouts are. When you think about it, you've got your layout, but think about all the people that you've learned from, that you've incorporated it. So almost every layout is a mixture of everyone else's layout, if you think about it like that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the blessing of doing this podcast is I've learned so much.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a little challenging too, because you got to set yourself up some guardrails because you see or hear so many amazing ideas that you want to apply and you're just not able to. Has that happened with you as well? Some things that you would love to be able to do and just can't get it to seem to make it fit in?
I see people that have, larger spaces and they're able to model every single town along the line. They don't have to make any compromise about, I'm going to leave out Windsor, Missouri, but include, Calhoun, Missouri instead, wherever they're at, you could apply it to the location. But, that's one thing that I'm a little jealous of guys that they're able to do that. Or perhaps, they have an area where they model out west where there are no towns. I think that's kind of cool too, because they're able to replicate those wide open spaces of running, and they don't have to worry about, cutting certain towns out or cutting certain industries out because there were no towns or industries. So that's kind of something that I think is kind of nice that a lot of people have the freedom to do when they do that. And so, no matter what time frame you model or what location, I think there's individual sets of challenges for all of those.
What would you say is the biggest challenge you face as a model railroader?
One of my challenges, I think, is my track work. And I talked about earlier how I love track work and getting that right. But strangely enough, I feel like that's the biggest challenge for me. Whenever I lay a new stretch of track, I will often procrastinate just because the ballasting and how I go about it. I'm probably a little bit too OCD about it, but what I like to put into it, knowing what it's going to take, I will just put it off and put it off. And when I get to it finally, I love it. It takes a while to do it. I got certain techniques that I have to get everything looking right. Then I can stand back and look at it and think, hey, that looks pretty good. I'm satisfied with that. But it is a challenge. I would say some of the electronics, my layout here, I have an NCE system. It's pretty basic. And I will go to a lot of guys' layouts and they have miles of wiring and computers. And I'm kind of envious of that, only because even though I fancy myself kind of a tech guy, that is one whole realm that just kind of makes me dizzy to even think about. And so I would say wiring is a challenge. I keep it very, very simple within my skill level, enough to get the job done.
You mentioned at the top of the show with the first layout, it wasn't really one that you could have a whole bunch of folks over and operate. Will that change with this new layout?
Most certainly. Yeah. And I'm trying to, keep the aisles, as I mentioned, wide enough to have a few people. I'm going to have multiple areas to switch. I'm going to have this power plant. I'm going to have the city of Sedalia and the city of Clinton, lots of industries there. So I'm going to have plenty of work to keep pretty few operators busy out here. I'm seeing people watching the channel and asking, hey, when can we come out and operate the layout and see the layout? And I'm still at a point right now where I'm not quite ready to have folks over. I suppose we could have an operating session because I have one town completed, Ladue, Missouri, that has two industries. Takes me about 10 minutes to switch, but we're going to get there. And I've got a long list of folks who are on that. They're going to be the first to call when I have that first operating session. But I am trying to keep that in mind for the long term. For instance, the restroom. I mean, that's for me, but also thinking about people being able to stay down here and be comfortable. Just, spend a long time down here and enjoy it.
In the interim, do you get an opportunity to operate in on other layouts?
I don't actually. When I go on these layout tours, that happens. I have the world's strangest work schedule, and so I do travel a lot on weekends for different activities and stuff. And so when I go on some of these layout tours, I have the chance to do that. And I love seeing some of the layouts. But locally, there aren't a whole lot of layouts here in my city in Missouri. A few years ago, it seemed like there used to be a lot more. A lot of people who would get together. Up in Kansas City, just a couple of hours north of here, they have a massive community of model railroaders with lots of layouts. Kansas City may have more layouts per capita than any city I know. Maybe there's other cities with more layouts, but they have events up there during a lot of the train shows. They have opportunities for you to get up there and operate and visit and such. But here in Springfield, it's a big enough town where there's a lot of model railroaders, but not a lot of public layouts or layouts where they have folks come over for regular operating sessions.
And that's a key part to remember too, as you're building a layout, and you're always building it for you. And that's always
Mm-hmm.
the first and foremost thing to remember. But when you don't have a ton of operators around, you don't want to build a massive layout. It sounds like you're building something that's really going to fit for one is you and your ability to go down and operate it when you choose, but then also when that opportunity presents to have a few folks over as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I will never need, a ton of operators here. I mean, the line I'm modeling was not very busy. They had maybe 2 trains, 3 trains a day tops. You had one general freight train, oftentimes a coal train. So there was not a ton of traffic. There was a local train that was searching the individual industries. And so, a handful of people, we could stay busy with that, but I'm sure, we can find ways to keep as many people that want to stay busy.
Talk about the balance between building your layout and your YouTube channel, the main track. How does that work for you? It is that hobby within a hobby. How does that balance all work for you?
It can be a challenge balancing it sometimes, and I'll be honest with you. Sometimes, I have an episode planned in my head of, a particular project that I'm doing. And when I get to it, I'm just enjoying building it. I'm enjoying, getting my mind off just what's going on in the world, relieving stress and working on the project. And for me, sometimes when you do the video aspect of it, it is more work. I love doing video. I think I mentioned this in my last appearance with you, but mentioning once again, my day job is I work in television news, which is all about lights, cameras, action, computers all day long. So sometimes when I get home, yeah, I have those skills to be able to apply that to my hobby and share it. But it's like, if I've been doing that all day, I just want to work on a locomotive or, lay some track. And so I wish I could do more episodes. I have a lot of guys all the time asking me, why don't you put a video out every week or more often? And I would, and I could, and I'm all the time working on episodes, one or another, but it can be kind of fun, a challenge balancing it sometimes, but I do really enjoy both. And I'm glad I have the opportunity to kind of combine two different things that I love.
Yeah, and hopefully one helps fuel the other, and back and forth, right?
It certainly does. Yeah. And it's kind of fun to be able to, we were talking about during our air check, getting this little studio area rigged up. That's kind of fun,
Mhm.
being able to share that. And I enjoy the technological aspect of it, just video editing and, using different cameras and stuff to try out on the layout, which is sort of another element that unless you have a YouTube channel, you don't really dive into with the model railroading. But it's something that I really like to do and combine.
I find your videos very entertaining. They're not overly
Thank you.
long. They're very digestible, I guess is what it is. The last one I watched, I think it was 8 to 10 minutes. Some a little longer, some a little shorter, but it definitely is a great little entertaining hit to see
Mhm.
what you're up to or where you've been or get some updates on your layout. And you do them, of course. You're a professional broadcaster because we can tell when we watch your videos, they're
Yeah.
professionally done. That makes them always fun to be able to check out and
Yeah.
enjoy.
And with the length of the videos, I see guys that are putting out 30-minute videos, hour-long videos, and I watch those and I love those. But the length of my videos likely comes from just my background and my day job. When you're on the news, you have a 30-minute show to fit so much into. You may have 2 minutes to tell a story. And so I'm used to being able to condense everything. I may want to talk for an hour or two, but I've been able to learn how to condense things so people can digest it. People's attention spans are only so long. And so, yeah, that may result in shorter videos. Hopefully it's enough to get the point across and not bore people for too long.
No, I think that's exactly what makes it work so well is that it's not a long-term commitment. It's kind of where I've aimed with the podcast. We
Yeah.
keep it within an hour or less so that folks commuting to and from work, hopefully within that hour time frame on the average, that you're able to listen to the first half and then catch the back half on your way home or
Yeah.
digest it relatively easy. And for you, the same thing with video because we want to be able to watch it and then move on or get down to the layout room and take all that energy that you're providing through your videos and use it to turn our flywheels and get our projects going as well. So
Yeah.
it's really great. And it's so much fun to share this hobby in these type of mediums for sure.
Yeah. Whether you're learning something by visiting somebody's layout or you've read something or you just figured out some new technique on your own, you do have this excitement of wanting to share it because other fellow model railroaders are maybe searching for answers or they want to know how to do something. They've got some burning question. And so there is kind of an excitement to be able to, hey, look what I learned or here's what I did. And hopefully, benefiting them as they sharpen their skills as well.
Absolutely. Well, folks, check out the main track on YouTube. You can check that out at youtube.com/@main track. And of course, you can find that link on our website, aroundthelayout.com/158. We'll also share some images of Mike's outstanding layout before and some update pictures as well. And then, of course, you can check out those videos. We look forward to watching the progress as you rebuild the MKT Sedalia Sub, the second version of this layout, and seeing how you recreate some memories from your past. And let's not make it so long before we have you back on again, and we'll get some more updates.
Hey, that sounds great. I'm on a roll down here, and so I should have plenty to talk about. I love talking about trains.
Awesome. I'll look forward to seeing you at the St. Louis RPM. But
Yes.
until then, Thanks for coming on and sharing your updates with us.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.